I was now in the heart of Thessaly, renowned the whole world over as the cradle of magic arts and spells.
Thessaly is a region in the central part of mainland Greece, mainly consisting of plains surrounded by high mountains. The plains were considered in antiquity to be some of the most fertile ground for growing things like grain, and in fact it is one of Greece's top agricultural regions still today. The other major export in antiquity were horses. Thessaly was known for its horses and also for its riders. The Thessalian cavalry features pretty prominently in descriptions of military engagements that involved Thessaly. As for the political situation, the region was made up primarily of mostly politically independent city-states that ran under an oligarchic system, and in times of crisis as needed, someone called a tagus could be appointed to sort of govern all of Thessaly's military forces while the situation was unfolding, and then afterwards everybody would go on their merry way. When you read ancient descriptions of Thessaly, you might notice that the region had a reputation for its luxurious and opulent lifestyle. And this is a pejorative in Greek literature. This was not a good thing. Primarily, luxury was associated with the East, so literally anything east of Greece. And so to be associated with those cultures was generally considered to be a bad thing because Greece was often at war with its eastern neighbors. And this reputation for opulence is kind of the beginning of our story today. The excess and greed of the supposed Thessalian lifestyle carried over into visions of what its religious life was like. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence for Thessalian religion, especially compared to places like Athens, where we have a lot of evidence, and most of the written records that we have, apart from epigraphy, apart from inscriptions, come from writers from Attica. And again, they have this negative bias towards Thessalian people. So for a lot of the literary descriptions of Thessalian religion, we have to be a little bit cautious in how we approach it. A great resource, if you can get your hands on it, is a book called Religion and Society in Ancient Thessaly by a scholar named Maria Mili. Now, I read a good chunk of this book in preparation for this video, and it is a super detailed outline of everything there is to know about Thessalian religion. I'm not going to get into the specifics too much today because it's not really our purpose here, but if this is something you're interested in, I highly recommend reading this book if you can find access to it. I had to use institutional access, so I'm not really sure. I'll put the citation for it down below, but I'm not really 100% certain if it's available through other channels. So the basic structure of Thessalian religion follows pretty much all the other Greek city-states. They had the same gods, or mostly the same gods, and the gods had relatively similar functions to their jobs in other places. The one major difference is that in antiquity and even into early modern archaeology, Thessaly had a reputation for being obsessed with death cults. As soon as I say that, the thunder starts rolling, of course. The only thing that we have to sort of prove that Thessaly had cults of death in the first place is that some shrines or some votive deposits were found kind of in the vicinity of some cemeteries, and there was a lot of activity surrounding Hermes, who had a chthonic function. He was a kind of underworld god. He guided the dead from the world of the living into the afterlife, so he had free passage to go into the underworld. But other than that, we really don't have a lot of evidence to say that the Thessalians were obsessed with death cults. They may have had some, maybe they may have had more than others, but a lot of this comes from biases that were already existing, like I talked about. This idea of clinging too much to life, being too concerned about the pleasures of being alive, that there was a desire to not let life go. The other reputation that Thessaly had is the subject of today's video, and that is their supposed obsession with magic. According to ancient writers, Thessaly was the land of the witches. It's the place where witches did their magic. It's the place where they grew their herbs or harvested their herbs for magic spells. And it gets this reputation of being a place where wonder workers just are or travel to. So we will explore that in detail in this video, but the last thing I'll say by way of kind of introduction is that in Latin literature, especially in Latin poetry, they don't use the word Thessaly as much as they use the word Haemonia. So you can see where I'm going with this. Part of the reason why I wanted to do this video is because that's where I got my name for the channel, is this reputation of Thessaly for being the home of the witches. But because I work primarily with Latin literature, I called myself Hearth of Haemonia. So when we're talking about magic in antiquity, the word itself is kind of problematic and it leads to a little bit of confusion, but generally I'm talking about ritual specialists, anybody who would make a curse tablet upon request, anybody who's performing love magic for you, herbalists, people who work in divination that are like outside of the religious sphere, so anybody who's using unconventional methods for divination, necromancers, wonder workers, anybody who's doing like the water to wine kind of awesome party tricks. These are all people that maybe today we would classify under the banner of magic. And generally what I mean by magic in this context of today's video is just anybody who was considered outside of the usual when it comes to religion or science, philosophy, medicine, anything like that. And for real-life practitioners, in particular itinerant wonder workers, people who were traveling around and either selling their magic as a ritual specialist or performing miracles for money, these people, or I guess also not for money, I don't know. For these people, it would be a bonus if they could claim that they are from Thessaly, because Thessaly's reputation preceded them. The agricultural production of the region does lend itself to a reputation for witchcraft, because Thessaly, as I said, was known for growing grains, but it was especially fertile and it grew all different sorts of plants, and notably herbs. I don't see why it wouldn't be the case in real life that there would be more herbal practitioners in a region that was rich in herbs. So as far as I'm concerned, there probably were more, old women of the wilderness that were out there making healing potions, making love spells, doing all these things because they had the resources easily available to them. Another connection to magic is that the goddess Enodia, who is sometimes associated with Hecate, Persephone, etc., she was one of the goddesses that features pretty heavily in the inscriptions that we have from Thessaly. So it may be the case that her worship, either in real life or just by reputation, lent itself to more witchcraft activity. The earliest references we have in literature to Thessaly being a magical place or a place where witches do their activity comes from the 5th century. In Athens, there are sporadic references here and there, and it starts to become a little bit more prominent when we get into the Hellenistic period. But by the time we get to the Roman period, so we'll say like 1st century, either side, BCE, CE, this idea really just takes off. Roman writers are always talking about Thessalian women or Haemonian women and using the term Haemonian woman, as a poetic stand-in for the term witch. Now, what's interesting to me is that the most famous Thessalian witch wasn't from Thessaly at all. Do you know who I'm talking about? I'm talking about Medea, ancient Greece's most famous witch. And yes, she is called, especially in poets like Ovid, she is called the Haemonian woman. Now that's interesting because she's not actually from Thessaly. She's from Colchis and only spent a very brief period in Thessaly where she performed magic using herbs that were local to the area. And much like saying the Haemonian women or Thessalian women was a stand-in for all witches, using the name of Medea also became a stand-in for all witches. If you want to know more about her story, I break down all of the different source material in this video somewhere up here. One of the most thorough descriptions of witchcraft in Thessaly comes from the author Lucan and his epic poem The Bellum Cuile, also called the Pharsalia. Now, I'm gonna have to treat this in its own video because, one, it's my favorite. I don't care that nobody loves you. I love you. And the scene with the witch takes up so many lines that it's impossible to do it justice as part of this video, but I will summarize. The poem is a retelling of the civil war between Julius Caesar and his rival / ex-son-in-law Pompey Magnus. The culminating scene is the Battle of Pharsalus, which is why it's sometimes called the Pharsalia. Pharsalus is one of the city-states in Thessaly, even though it's all pretty much under Roman control right now. And because the setting of the real-life battle takes place in this land that has this reputation for witchcraft and magic, Lucan takes this and runs with it.
And on its crags the land of Thessaly produced both harmful herbs and stones, which hear magicians chanting dreadful secrets. There arises many a substance which puts constraint upon the gods, and in Haemonian lands the Colchian stranger gathered herbs she had not brought with her.
Lucan is writing in the period that some people call the Silver Age of Latin literature, which is a renaissance of the arts under the Emperor Nero. So a lot of time has passed since the events that he's describing, and in Lucan's worldview, this was the end of free society and the beginning of the horrible imperial period that he does not have any desire to live under. So not only is Lucan disenchanted with the whole situation, but he's also writing during a period where tastes in art had changed, and people now were more interested in the darker, spookier, more kind of psychological literature, akin to what we today might call horror. So you've got Seneca writing a Medea play about how she kills her children. He writes one that features cannibalism, like cannibalism within the family, super extra dark and depressing and also scary. This is the environment that Lucan is writing in. So his whole poem, super goth, love it. He spends a lot of time in the lead up to the battle describing the witchcraft of the land of Thessaly. Like I said, I can't talk about each line here, but I will at some point in the future. He basically lays out all of the ways that Thessalians, especially Thessalian women, work their magic and engage in their witchcraft. And then he says that the witch in question that he's writing about laughs at all of that as being childish, because she is worse. She is scary, she's old and ugly and disfigured, she's robbing graves, she's murdering people, she's engaging in light cannibalism, and all sorts of scary bad stuff. But her reputation precedes her, and Pompey's son, Sextus Pompey, goes to consult her because he has heard that she can tell the future. And she does tell the future for him using necromancy. Very cool, very exciting. And he gets his prophecy, and then the story goes on to describe the battle. When we talk about Thessalian witches in literature, that's like the primary example to use because it takes up I don't know how many hundreds of lines, and it has everything. It talks about Thessaly being the land of herbs, it talks about all the different kinds of magic, it talks about the relationship between the witches and the gods, which is not really kosher under Roman religious standards because they compel the gods to do things. It's got a little bit of everything. I would highly recommend checking it out. I always use Susan Braun's translation. I think it's great. So I'll put a link in the description to that as well. The next major work of literature that uses this premise of Thessaly being the home of the witches is Apollonius. You know him, you love him, you've watched my series about him. Apollonius' novel The Golden Ass, sometimes called The Metamorphoses, basically hinges entirely on the premise that Thessaly is a magical place. The entire plot can only happen because the main character Lucius goes to Thessaly. He encounters witchcraft there. He encounters the reputation of it before he even gets there. And then he goes to Thessaly. He meets witches in real life. He engages in magical practice, and he fucks it up, and that's why he's turned into a donkey for the rest of the story. From the second Lucius hits Thessaly, he is immediately bombarded by the reputation, by the preponderance of witchcraft. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Salem, Massachusetts. I just went again recently. I haven't been in almost a decade. And you can just tell, like, even if there's just a coffee shop, it's gonna be called, like, Witch's Brew or something. The whole place is a witchcraft kind of community, at least as Apollonius describes it. And Lucius is so eager, so curious to engage in this kind of stuff that he just can't wait to get his hands on it, and, you know, that kind of gets the best of him. So we've traced kind of the literary development of this reputation, and I want to end with a discussion about a real-life Thessalian witch. Someone who we have multiple sources for, who presumably was an actual person who actually practiced, or at least claimed to practice, a form of lunar magic. Her name was Aglaonike, which means something like luminous victory. We don't know exactly when she lived, but she had to have lived sometime between the 4th century BCE and around 100 CE. In the 4th century BCE, the Babylonians, who were working on astronomy, discovered how eclipses work and figured out the technology for how to predict them. This will become important later on. She couldn't have lived any time after 100 CE because that's when Plutarch is writing, and he is our main source for her. She pops up in 2 of his essays, part of the collection called the Moralia, and she also appears from a much later note called a Scholion to Apollonius of Rhodes, the guy who was writing about Medea, or one of the guys who was writing about Medea. So we know that Aglaonike lived in Thessaly. All of the sources agree on that. Her father was maybe a guy named Hegetor or maybe a guy named Hegemon, depending on who you read. It is possible that she knew some astrology as well, but that doesn't really catch on in Greece until the Hellenistic period, at least not in any sort of complete way, but she's referred to as an astronomer. So Aglaonike's claim to fame is that she said that she could draw the moon down from the sky. If you're at all familiar with ancient witchcraft, you'll know that this is one of the major things that witches are supposed to be able to do, is draw the moon down from the sky. I don't think that she invented this concept or that she was the first to claim that this could happen, but she's the one that has the reputation for it. So she must have been very active in describing her talents and what she could do. The first literary reference to drawing down the moon comes from Aristophanes' play The Clouds, where the main character is thinking, oh, I can just do what the Thessalian witches do, draw down the moon from the sky, and if there's no moon, then there's no tomorrow, and I won't have to pay my debts. It's a foolproof plan, obviously. This notion of drawing down the moon becomes very popular, and Aglaonike herself was said to claim that she could do this. Now, both of Plutarch's references to Aglaonike are kind of like sandwiched in to other things that he's talking about. In the Conjugalia Praecepta, he's talking about like tips for marriage, and one of the things that he's saying is that a wife should be instructed in things like geometry and philosophy and all the usual, sort of aristocratic pursuits. He says this will keep her out of trouble, and if anyone comes along and claims that they can draw down the moon, she'll be able to say that that's stupid because she is familiar with astronomy. And then he tells the story of Aglaonike.
Studies of these sort keep women away from vice. For a woman who is learning geometry will be ashamed to dance, and she won't accept stories about witches when she's charmed enough by the words of Plato and Xenophon. And if anyone claims to draw down the moon, she'll laugh at the ignorance and stupidity of the women who believe these things, since she has knowledge of astronomy and has heard about Aglaonike, the daughter of Hegetor, the Thessalian, that because she was acquainted with full moon eclipses and could predict the time when the moon happens to be cast in shadow, she deceived the women and persuaded them that she herself was drawing down the moon.
He repeats pretty much the same story in his De Defectu Oraculorum, where he's talking a little bit about divination, a little bit about astronomy, a little bit about physics, and he's basically making the argument that you can't eliminate the mediation of daimones between the humans and the gods. So like the gods are up here, daimones are in the middle, and then humans are down below. So you need mediators. You can't just like involve the god in your affairs. And he makes this kind of, I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but he says if someone were to take the air out from between the moon and the earth, then everything would collapse and like the universe would explode. And then he tells the story of Aglaonike again.
Getting the god involved in human affairs and activities, and drawing him down to human needs, just as the Thessalian women are said to do with the moon. But this trick of theirs had credibility among women. Aglaonike, daughter of Hegetor, so they say, a woman astronomer, since she could always predict an eclipse of the moon, bewitched it and drew it down.
So Plutarch has no time for magic, Plutarch has no time for party tricks, and he basically is arguing that Aglaonike's claim that she can draw down the moon is a trick that she plays on unsuspecting women because they are not trained in astronomy like she is. And they don't realize that when the moon is eclipsed, it's just an astronomical phenomenon and it will be coming back. So he basically says that she's a fraud. Now, unfortunately, because this is the primary evidence for her existence, we don't know whether or not she was a fraud, whether or not she genuinely believed that she was doing this, said that she was doing this, said it symbolically, or that she's spiritually drawing down the power of the moon. We just don't know. But Plutarch at least says that she knows what she's doing and she's intentionally deceiving people. The implication is for money. Now, the Scholion to Apollonius of Rhodes says basically the same thing, but he adds that there was a consequence for Aglaonike after she made this extraordinary claim.
In the case of Aglaonike, daughter of Hegemon, since she was experienced in astronomy and knew the eclipses of the moon, whenever these things were going to happen, she said that the goddess drew it down, and straightway she fell into misfortunes when she lost someone in her household.
This idea that Thessalian witches who sort of broke the laws of nature and divine laws maybe had some divine retribution coming to them for their actions. And this is corroborated all the way back in Plato, where in the Gorgias he has Socrates talking about the punishments that Thessalian witches undergo when they do their magic. So it is possible, I suppose, that this was another part of Thessaly's reputation, was that the Thessalian witches had some kind of consequence coming to them. Now that's in the nonfiction, or what we might classify as nonfiction writers. That doesn't show up anywhere in the literature, in the poetry as far as I'm aware. The only one who gets punished for doing magic in Apuleius is Lucius, unfortunately. The association of Thessaly with witchcraft largely comes from biased reports from people who don't live there. However, it is a land rich in herbs. They grow well with a wide variety there, so I don't see why it's impossible for this reputation to have some truth behind it. Were there more herbalists working in Thessaly than in other city-states or regions? Maybe. We don't really know, it's hard to say. But in my estimation, I do think it's entirely possible. Aglaonike's claim, if we can take Plutarch seriously that she herself was claiming to have these powers, tells us that maybe Thessalian women saw themselves almost as other people saw them, as magical practitioners who could do extraordinary things, or at least could claim to. Additionally, the potential prevalence of funerary cults, death cults, Orphism, which I didn't really talk about, but Orphism was apparently really popular in Thessaly as well. This lends to the overall picture of a dark and spooky magic land of Thessaly. Now, all of this is speculation based on reports written by people who maybe we shouldn't take at face value. The only thing we can say for certain is that Thessaly had a reputation for its magical exploits, cunning women, bountiful herbs, and air of mystery kind of wafting around the whole place. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you like this sort of content, I'm always posting about the magic, religion, belief, generally speaking, of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So if you like that sort of thing and you want to stick around, feel free to subscribe to the channel. That's all I have for you today. Thank you again for watching. I really, truly appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one.